Hello and welcome to Since Attlee and Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party, and Lee's husband. In each episode, we will be chewing over delightful morsels of British political history.
This week we're starting a mini-series with a difference. We're launching a summer book club, so to speak, and we're going to be interviewing several authors who have written books recently that we think will be of interest to listeners. We're going to do it in two chunks, 3 of them in July and then a few later on in the summer, with some of our normal Sunday episodes interspersed in between.
This first episode is going to be with Alwyn Turner, whose new book, entitled A Shellshocked Nation, looks at Britain in the interwar period, which we think we can get away with in our Since Attlee and Churchill theme, because both Attlee and Churchill were very much part of the politics of interwar Britain, just as they were of post-war Britain.
It's a book that I really enjoyed reading, and I really enjoyed our conversation actually with Alwyn as well. So here it is. Well, we're delighted for this episode to be joined by Alwyn Turner, who is one of the most prodigious authors of certainly 20th century Britain and a little bit either side as well. He's written books including Crisis, What Crisis?, Rejoice, Rejoice, and A Classless Society, about Britain in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, respectively, plus a book about the very beginning of this century, All in It Together, which actually I listened to. I heard that as an audiobook when I was out campaigning the other year quite a lot on it, so it kept me sane when trotting through villages and delivering leaflets. Most recently, Alwyn has gone a little further back in time with Little Englanders, and now A Shellshocked Nation on the interwar years, which we'll be discussing today. So, Alwyn, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here.
To get us into the topic, I wondered, before you started your research on this book, and then after it, I wonder what part of your views about Britain in the interwar years changed the most, or what most surprised you about what you learned when researching the book?
To be honest, it's not a period that I knew in any detail whatsoever. I knew quite a lot of the cultural side of it. I read a lot of the fiction from the time. I knew some of the movies and quite a lot of the music. But the politics was not in any way a specialist area of mine. And I think what most surprised me was how much respect I ended up with for Stanley Baldwin, which wasn't where I'd expected to be. It was a lot of it was just discovering things that I just didn't know.
That's something I sympathise with, certainly on the Baldwin front, because I think it's sometimes when we think about political history in particular, of course, there are the titanic figures, the people who generally get credit because they change something quite significantly. There's statues when you walk into the lobby of the House of Commons, and often I think they're the prime ministers who brought about dramatic change. Often overlooked the prime ministers who didn't, and in part because they didn't want to. And I think Baldwin falls into that category.
I think he's probably the exemplar of that category, isn't he? The steady as she goes approach is not one that's going to win you great plaudits for heroism, but there are times when it's absolutely necessary. And I think that was what most struck me about this period, is why is it that at a time when virtually all of Europe is veering towards an extreme right or sometimes an extreme left position, Britain stays so incredibly moderate. And clearly a large part of that is because Baldwin is there as the dominant figure for the best part of 2 decades.
I would agree with that. I mean, the period you've written about here, the interwar years, so just for the benefit of perhaps international listeners in particular who may not necessarily use that term, of course, it's the period between the First World War and the Second World War. And in some ways, I think you can think of it as being divided up into 2 halves. How the country comes to terms with the aftermath of the First World War and all of the loss and all of the destruction that it has suffered, and then the build-up to what would be the catastrophe of the Second World War. But I wanted to think about the first half of that, how the country came to terms with the bloodshed of 1914 to 1918, because it was a period in which almost every community in the country was affected, with the small exception of the few thankful villages. And what stood out to you when researching and writing the book about the ways in which the country handled the aftermath and came to terms with what had happened in the First World War?
I think the most striking thing about it was just how little public discussion there is of the war itself. It almost vanishes because we have a perception now that is dominated so heavily in cultural terms by the war poets. But the truth is, of course, nobody was reading them. They weren't popular. They're much more read now than they were in the 1920s. In the 1920s, people didn't wish to read this stuff. And there are stories of publishers saying, we can't give away these books. Nobody is interested. And it's not until 10 years later, I mean, it's almost exactly on the 10th anniversary of Armistice Day, that suddenly there is this big bulge of successful works come out about the First World War. But there are very few movies that deal with it. The British film industry is quite prolific at this stage, but is simply not interested in approaching this as a subject. The literature barely exists, and where it does, it tends to be thrillers rather than gritty accounts of trench warfare or whatever. There's an almost deliberate silence, it seems to me, and to some extent that's replicated after the Second World War, but for a much shorter period. And I think there is an extraordinary amount of private grief, obviously, but there's not a lot of public grief. It's focused entirely on the Armistice Day commemorations once a year, and that's only the one day, and everything is concentrated into that. I mean, to the extent that you're not allowed to sell poppies any time before Armistice Day. There's none of this big build-up that we have now where, I mean, obviously the BBC doesn't exist on television at this stage, but there's none of that pressure that you've got to be wearing a poppy for 2 weeks beforehand. Or it is kind of hived off and sectioned off as one day we will remember. But for the other 364 days of the year, frankly, we'd rather put it to one side. There's rebuilding to be done. And I think a lot of it is, as I say, just an almost willful amnesia.
One of the striking things about the interwar era is that although it's not a period of profound constitutional change, although there are moments where that might have happened, it is an era where there is significant political change, at least at the top of party politics, where the Liberal Party is supplanted by the Labour Party as one of the governing or official opposition parties in British politics. And you mention in the book about the publication of George Dangerfield's famous book, The Strange Death of Liberal England. And I wonder what your thoughts are on what killed the Liberal Party as one of the top two parties in British politics. Was that inevitable, do you think, given the wider social changes that you chart in the book about this era? Or do you think it was quite contingent and that there's a minimal change alternative history where the Liberal Party does survive as one of the main parties in British politics?
I mean, you say there's no constitutional change. There is technically not, but there is a massive increase of the franchise, which is just a huge development.
Yeah.
And given the sudden influx of women and of the working class into the electorate, things are going to change. The two-party system is going to readjust. I don't think it's obvious that the Liberal Party should be the victims of that. It seems to be perfectly plausible that it could have been the Conservative Party. And what ensures that it's not, I guess, is the Liberals deciding that they can't agree with themselves, that Asquith and Lloyd George are going to fight and at times lead separate versions of the Liberal Party. And we got to the stage in 1931 where there's 3 different Liberal parties contesting the general election. And if you're going to do that, you can't expect to get anywhere, really. But the other element to it is going back to Baldwin. Baldwin is very clear that he wishes to destroy the Liberal Party. If there's going to be 2 survivors, he's determined, obviously, that one of them should be the Tories. And the Liberals can be marginalised, and he goes out of his way to make sure that he does so. And I think a lot of it is strategic thinking by Baldwin of how you elbow this party out of office, helped by his own personal dislike of Lloyd George. But I think there's something bigger than that going on. He's aware that that you can squeeze the Liberals if the Conservative Party moves more left, as it does. You can hive off a chunk of the Liberals, and a chunk of them will disappear on the left to the Labour Party, and you can resolve this very unstable period. I mean, you have general elections in 3 consecutive years in the early 1920s. You have 4 prime ministers in the space of 3 years. I mean, very, very unlike our own times. And there is, I think, within that, a very definite attempt by him, by Baldwin, to elbow people out the way. It's and I think it is a parallel with today, that when you get new forces and new elements appearing in politics, first past the post takes a while to churn through that and to resolve it back into the two parties that will contest. And we are going through that period now, but that's very much the story of the 1920s. I mean, it's a period in those 20 years between the wars, 21 years, there's a whole succession of minority governments, coalitions. It's very rare for there to be one dominant party within that. And yeah, it's. I don't think it's inevitable the Liberals go into such steep decline.
And did people draw the conclusion from that rapid change and the instability of governments at that time that Britain was ungovernable? I mean, we hear this right now at
And
the moment with this sense of changing through many prime ministers in a decade and so on. Was that same sense of ungovernability there, or how did people react to that change?
I don't think there is. I didn't come across this at all, anyone discussing ungovernability. And maybe some of that is because there are these big figures that return. I mean, as opposed to now where we've got constant churn. Baldwin's prime minister 3 times, Ramsay MacDonald twice. There is a certain stability within that. And Lloyd George is clearly a fading force right the way through the 1920s, but he's still there. It is still the same figures who are in the front line. And I think that maybe changes it. There is still a sense of stability within that.
If I make a brief pro-Baldwin point as well, I think sometimes the cause of that instability is actually a sense of some political decency. So, going to the country in 1923 over the question of protection, because he thinks protection is necessary, but he doesn't think the Conservatives have a mandate to do it.
Yeah.
Going to the country, losing the election and throwing away the office, in one sense is an absurd thing that does cause a degree of chaos, but it's also a very decent thing to do, kind of as well, really, not to just try and say, well, look, we've got a majority in the House of Commons. We've also got more peers in the Lords. We want to do it. We're doing it. And it's in a sense something that I think you could admire about how the system sort of plays out. But also, of course, as ever with Baldwin, I'm very glad that you're so drawn to him when researching and writing the book, because there's so much, I think, to like about Baldwin, including the way in which, on one level, he's mastering the sort of amiable country folk type image, about the thing that Lord Curzon said about him wanting to be with his pigs and to read the books that he wants to read. But he's also strategically, I think, got a very clear sense of where he wants the party to sit and where he wants the British government to go over this period of time. And it's not always frenetic energy, but I think nevertheless there's an underlying strategy behind it.
Yeah, I think that's true. And that whole image of his pigs and his books was very carefully cultivated for the mass media. He's the first politician who actually understands that the media are changing and knows how to use radio. And from a very early stage is being filmed for Pathé News reports in the cinemas. And as soon as they get onto the talkies and he can actually speak as well as have his image there, he's a master of the cinema as well. He can deal with this new stuff. But yeah, I mean, this countryman image is quite impressive for a man who comes from a heavy industrial family and has no connection with the country particularly at all. But it's a great image. The stability of it, the idea that you start a radio broadcast with the sound of a match striking and lighting his pipe before he speaks. This is very good, careful media relations that he's worked out, as far as I can tell, on his own. I mean, there's no media advisor who's training him to do this stuff. He's just sharp enough to recognise that this new world that has this massively increased franchise and this new form of mass media is something that has to be mastered. He's very good at it.
And let me ask you about Baldwin's policy achievements or otherwise. The second Baldwin government in particular, that 1924 to 1929 Baldwin government, is often, from the left at least, vilified for the putting Britain on the gold standard at too high a rate, the consequences for workers' wages and hours, and the confrontation of the general strike, which you, of course, mention and discuss in the book. But I was struck by how you also wish to reflect on some of the reforms that came out of that Baldwin government as well. The creation of the Central Electricity Board, charged with setting up a national grid, which eventually puts a majority of the British public onto electricity at that time, or the abolition of the Poor Law Boards by Neville Chamberlain, who was Baldwin's health secretary, or, of course, the Representation of the People Act, 1928, which grants equal suffrage to women, or the increase of pensions for widows and orphans, the lowering of the retirement age the pensionable age from 70 to 65. So, looking at that Baldwin government in particular, which I guess is that's Baldwin's kind of strongest moment, politically speaking, where he's in charge of this government that goes for the full parliament. Would you describe that as a reforming government, a reactionary government, a government that has a mix of both? Is it a government we should remember better than we do?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is a reforming government. It is part of that wish to squeeze the Liberals by taking on policies that pre-First World War would have been seen as completely antithetical to conservatism and very definitely part of liberalism. He's colonising the ground in the centre that the Liberals used to occupy, or even the centre-left. And I think that is deliberate. The gold standard is clearly the biggest mistake of all. But it comes from, I guess, an understandable position. The empire is at its absolute peak in terms of land mass, having been, acquired various ex-German colonies after the Treaty of Versailles. The idea that you would not go back to the pre-war level of the rate of exchange would seem an admission of defeat, when it is clear that in Britain, people still see it as this country as the dominant force in the world. I mean, it's not by that stage. America's economy has massively overtaken, well, not massively, but has substantially overtaken Britain. But that's not going to sink in. I mean, in just normal psychological terms, that's the kind of adjustment that's going to take a long while to register. So I think it's an understandable mistake, but it clearly is a terrible mistake. The general strike probably would have happened at some point anyway, I think. I mean, it's exacerbated by the high rate of exchange, which makes coal exports more expensive, but coal exports are already suffering. And some kind of confrontation with the labour movement was probably inevitable. Given that, I think he handled it in a reasonably moderate way. There were certainly voices that he ignored that would have ramped up the conflict and would have made it much more confrontational. So I think, yeah, it is broadly a reforming government, and a mostly progressive one.
Why do you think he appointed Churchill to his government as chancellor. I think it took Churchill himself by surprise. I think the story is that Churchill thought when he was being made chancellor, he was being made chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, and then found out it was actually chancellor of the Exchequer.
Yes. Yeah, not an obvious appointment at all. But Churchill is a, a figure for many other books that still don't quite get him. He's such a strange character that everybody knows that he's extraordinarily talented and immensely charismatic and all the rest. He is one of the great men, and yet he gets virtually everything wrong. I mean, his judgment is appalling. And the gold standard is just part of that. He's also wrong on India. He's wrong on Ireland. He's wrong on the abdication. Virtually every single issue of judgment, he gets completely wrong, up until obviously 1940, when everything works fine. But yeah, I don't know. I think his Baldwin is to some extent seduced by the charisma of it. Maybe, I don't know. I genuinely don't know.
And maybe his liberal background, again, thinking
Yeah.
with your thesis of trying to position the Tories into that ground and winning over liberals to have I think Churchill hadn't really been a conservative very long at all
No,
at that point.
he just rejoined and was
Yeah.
immediately back in. I mean, it'd been part of the coalition government after the war. It served with Baldwin in cabinet, but yeah, I think that does help, and I think that's part where Churchill does get things right. Tends to be on things like the pension age and so on, which are much more from his tradition of liberal thinking of trying to build a welfare state.
I think in part as well, it was possibly the way in which Stanley Baldwin was thinking about trying to make sure the Conservative Party wasn't one of the victims of this change, because of course that one of the things that hangs in the background of this, and in some ways has parallels with recent years as we've thought about our relationship to Europe and trading with the rest of the world, is the question of protection and whether or not we have tariffs with the rest of the world, how we trade with the empire. And I think for Baldwin, sort of bringing Churchill into that shock role is one of a series of steps, I think, in which he tries to heal those wounds within the Tory party
Mhm.
and make sure that it isn't going to fracture. In some ways, it's one of the great successes, that as you've got people on the Liberal side standing in different parties over sometimes just differences of personality or simply differences of personality being quite front and centre. On the Tory side, you often have this fundamental divide about the way in which we should relate to the world when we're a major global power. And yet the party holds together, give or take, with it sometimes an Austin Chamberlain storming off here and there or whatever, but it generally manages to hold it.
It is the one constant through this period, is that while the Labour Party splits and has factions and expels leaders, and the Liberals fall into just stupid civil war, the Tories sail on as a united party through the whole thing, and get a larger share of the vote in every single general election between the wars. I mean, it is an extraordinary record of success. Even when the Labour Party forms its two minority governments, it still hasn't got the vote that the Tories manage.
On that theme, I wonder about the way in which people would come back afterwards to look at this period. And I think if we think about Baldwin's reputation, of course, what does the most harm for Baldwin's reputation is appeasement. But I think also in the years after the Second World War, part of what does him harm as well is a sense that the 1930s were a dreadful, wasted decade. It sort of takes on this impression in many people's minds that Attlee must build a welfare state, etc., so we don't go back to the 1930s. But at the time, it is not especially obvious that the 1930s is some appalling decade. Of course, there's the crash and there's a Great Depression at the end of the 20s and into the early 1930s. And there's pockets of destitution in the country and some of the industrialized areas that lead to some of the protests and like the marches to Hyde Park, etc., that you write about in the book. But at the same time, it's also a period in which some of the key political figures in the country are actually quite respected, and people's material wealth for the whole country in many ways, and their prosperity appears to be getting better for much of this. I wonder, well, whether or not you think that the way in which people came to think about the 1930s and the record of governments in it was particularly fair.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is obviously true that there are parts of the country that are hit very badly in the 1930s. If you live in South Wales or in the northeast, these are horrible times. But most of the country enjoys a rising standard of living during the same period. The Depression is not as bad in Britain as it is in France, in Germany, in America. Partly that's because the economy has been fairly, not quite flatlining, but not far off, right the way through the 20s, so there's not so far to fall. But actually, the Depression is nowhere near as bad here as it might have been. And some of that is to do with the with government action, with the massive program of house building, which helped pull the country out of recession, and at the same time starts to create the great suburbs of the country where life is all right. I don't know. It does seem to me that it's not, the perception at the time is not as extreme as the perception from after the war. It took on a different image, I think, in subsequent years.
We've talked quite a lot about Baldwin and the Conservatives. We've talked a bit about the Liberals, but I'd like to ask a couple of questions about Labour. So obviously the 1920s is this really important breakthrough decade in the history of the Labour Party. In 1922, becoming the official opposition for the first time, and then in January of 1924, forming the first Labour government. And it seems to me that one of the tried attacks on Labour at this time was to associate the party with the threat of revolution and communism and the Soviet Union. And the most famous example of that is the Zinoviev letter in the 1924 general election. You also write about the Campbell case, which in a sense precipitated that general election regarding the prosecution of a communist newspaper writer in Scotland during the first Labour government. But I think you also give us some sense that these attacks weren't always terribly effective. And it's not even really that clear how effective the Zinoviev letter was. And Labour comes back to government at the following election in 1929. So to what extent do you think this strategy of tying Labour with communism and revolution did pack a punch in this era? And if it didn't, why was that? Was it about certain things that the Labour Party did that insulated itself, at least to some extent, from those attacks?
I think the thing with the Zinoviev letter, I think, does have an impact, but not on the Labour Party. It has an impact on the Liberals. Because what it does is it ensures if you're anti-Labour, you want to vote to keep out the Labour Party, rather than, and it's what we would now talk about of people lending their votes. I think there was an element of that, of the anybody but Labour. The Labour Party itself increased its vote perfectly happily. It didn't suffer directly, but I think the Liberals got caught out in it. It's a period that lasts. The attack on that lasts for only about 5 or 6 years, I think. After the general strike, it's very difficult to make that case, because the general strike had been so moderate in its conduct on the union side. And to some extent, I think that was shaped by the fact that there had been this barrage and this onslaught about it being a communist front. It was therefore determined to prove that it was not, and that there was no revolutionary intent whatsoever within the general strike. And I think the TUC's conduct and the Labour Party's conduct during the general strike had been shaped by the anti-communist rhetoric that had preceded it. It is undoubtedly there. I know I cite some of the very, very many fictional accounts that embed this as the detective story becomes one of the dominant forms of popular culture. There is a very strong anti-communist element that runs through that. You can see it in early 1920s Agatha Christie novels, where she writes thrillers as well as the detective stories, and there is an anti-communist feeling there, and an explicit argument that it is operating behind the scenes in the Labour Party. So I think it's part of the public perception of it. And then, as I say, I think after the general strike, that kind of fizzles out. You don't get the same kind of rhetoric in the popular culture in the 1930s that you do in the early 1920s. It's that shock of the Russian Revolution is so great. And immediately followed, of course, by the Irish Revolution, which at the time felt really serious as well. That the country itself is experiencing a civil war within what we then understood to be the United Kingdom, and so that fear of political violence and upheaval and revolution was real. The general strike, I think, finishes it because it's so clearly not a revolutionary moment.
And it's also quite difficult to pin that revolutionary charge on Ramsay MacDonald, certainly as time goes by. I liked in the book that you quote, I think it must be from MacDonald's diaries, how grumpy he is with Baldwin in the summer of 1925 for forming an agreement with the unions to maintain the subsidization of the miners' wages. And he says something like, Baldwin has given in to the worst Bolshevik elements of the union movement, or something like that. Do you see Ramsay MacDonald as a figure who becomes more conservative over time?
Mm-hmm.
Or do you, and what is driving that increasing conservatism in MacDonald?
Possibly just age. Never underestimate. But also, I mean, I keep on going back to, but Baldwin's invention of the idea that there should be an official leader of the opposition, that this is somehow a job in its own right. And we'll give it to Ramsay MacDonald, and we will get Ramsay MacDonald to form a government, even though he hasn't even got, not only not got a majority of MPs, he hasn't even got the largest number of MPs, but we'll still let him have a go. And it won't do any harm because he hasn't got the numbers to do any serious harm. He is gradually brought into the establishment. But that would be oversimplifying it, because he's already clearly pre-First World War. He's moving against the more extreme version of the labour movement. I mean, his denunciation of a general strike comes in about 1910, 1912. He's already against the idea, sees it as being part of syndicalism, and that's not what the Labour Party should be about. He's already committed to parliamentary democracy, and that becomes more so as he becomes more and more embedded in the parliamentary process. So I think he's already moving, and his contribution to the Labour Party is probably back in 1905, persuading the Liberals to stand down in a large number of seats so that the Labour Party can get representation. By the time he comes back in as leader, he's already quite an old man. He's been around a long time, and he represents a very mainstream parliamentary version of what the Labour Party should be. And he holds to it up until the great split of 1931.
One person who I think didn't get more conservative with age, who you write about, is George Lansbury, who becomes the Labour leader in the 1930s after that trauma of the 1931 election defeat. And you write in the book about the drama of Lansbury's departure as Labour leader at the 1935 Labour conference, where he is denounced by the Transport and General Workers Union, Ernest Bevan, for his pacifism and his sort of idealism, hawking his conscience from body to body. And I wonder how much you think that particular moment is a critical juncture in the development of the Labour Party and possibly in British history, in moving the Labour Party in that autumn of 1935 from Lansbury as leader to Clement Attlee as leader. I mean, is it too dramatic to say that the trade unions and Ernest Bevin saved the Labour Party at that particular moment?
No, I don't think that is too dramatic, but I think it's also to do George Lansbury justice, and I have a great fondness for Lansbury. I think he had already saved the Labour Party. He had done his bit. After 1931, the defeat was so huge in terms of parliamentary seats, not in terms of the vote necessarily, which declined but not anywhere near as substantially as the number of seats. But the parliamentary party was reduced to this rump, and it could have gone under. I think Lansbury held it together. The judgment of his opponents was that he was a very, very competent leader of the opposition. I think he kept the show on the road, and yeah, clearly by 1935, his message of pacifism was no longer appropriate. In an age of dictators, this didn't seem to be the most sensible response to scrap the fleet. But yeah, I think it is. I think Lansbury saves the party from that absolute humiliation. He gives it some dignity back, and by going back to his first principles, if not necessarily the party's, but he is clearly a deeply principled man. He gives it some dignity, and then yeah, the arrival of Attlee does change that entirely. And I don't know that it needed to be Attlee necessarily. I think Ernest Bevin is the clear dominant force in that. He not only gets rid of Lansbury, but he makes sure that the party is never going to be like that again.
Well, I wanted to come on to talk a little bit about culture, as lots of the book is really a cultural history as well as with political history in there. And actually, it's one of the things I really like about your books. It's really history as the people who lived through it may have known it, rather than just what I think is often quite easy to do, or to write the history of what do we remember from a period in time. You know, there are certain things that come up in the book. Edgar Wallace, the author, in fact, stands out for me as one of these, who almost everybody in the 1930s who lived in this country would have known who he was. A great many of them will have had copies of his books on their shelves or in their pockets as they got on the train or elsewhere. Today, he's hardly a known figure at all. Unlike, I suppose, somebody who it's perhaps easier to write about, and Agatha Christie, who, of course, is still very, very famous today. One of the things on a cultural side that this book corrected me on, really, is I thought of the interwar years as being the period of radio, as radio emerging and then becoming a very important medium, which of course it did. But also this is cheeringly a period for the book still, and the book not only having a maintaining its position in culture, but also in some ways strengthening it as well. You've already mentioned the detective novel, which becomes enormous around this time. But it's also the age of, I love the section about newspaper promotions to get the collected work of Dickens, etc. This is a period when national book tokens are launched, the Penguin paperback, the Left Book Club. It's clearly a resurgence, or certainly a very important period in the literary history of this country. And part of the reason I wanted to start with that is that there's something of a panic going on at the moment about declining literacy in our own country and other parts of the West. And we see that sometimes as being, well, technology is squeezing the book out, particularly around social media as well. But of course, this was a period in which technology could have been squeezing the book out with radio, but instead literature has this great prominence. I wonder what you would ascribe that to, and how important you thought, or how important you think the written word is in this period.
It is an extraordinarily successful period for published books. There are more books being published than ever before. The sales are bigger, and the libraries are doing incredibly good business. All sorts of different versions of libraries, ones that you subscribe to, and in the way that we used to with video shops, and the public libraries, the council libraries. It is partly, it's not simply radio, it's also cinema could have killed this off. This is, we're building up to, I think it's 1947 is the absolute peak in the number of admissions to the cinema in British history, but it's growing all the way through this time. And yet the book survives, and some of that is because it is a great period for fiction. The industry is good for it. There are new publishers appearing. The libraries are good. People have more leisure time. By the end of this period, the Holidays with Pay Act exists, and people are taking summer holidays to resorts where they will borrow books from the local libraries. But I think some of it is just about the quality of the writing. Edgar Wallace, I think, is the supreme example. He's incredibly good. I accept entirely, obviously, that he is now almost entirely forgotten. I mentioned the fact that he wrote the original story for King Kong, which is probably about the only thing that anybody does remember, but they don't remember it for him. He was reckoned to be responsible for 1 in 4 books that were read in the country. I mean, the scale of his success was really quite extraordinary. And he was knocking them out at a pretty fair rate. He was not by any means the most prolific. I mean, he only wrote about 120 novels in his life, whereas, you know, we have other people here who are, John Creasy, who ended up with 800 novels to his name. John Creasy, who's, again, one of my favourite writers of this period, he claimed that his record was he wrote 2 novels in a week. And he said, and I took the Saturday afternoon off to play cricket. Which is the right way to do it, obviously. And despite that incredible productivity of these sort of writers, they are actually very good. They survive remarkably well. And they're remarkably easy to read. And Wallace is the king of them. When I was doing the research on it, I went through the British newspaper archive doing a word search on the names of various writers, about 30 or 40 of the writers I could think of from this time. And Wallace gets more mentions than anybody else by a factor of about 3 to 1 over his nearest competitor. And his nearest competitors are the likes of Arthur Conan Doyle and Agatha Christie, who, you know, as you say, those names survive. But Wallace was way, way ahead of any of them. And it was a time when, allied to that incredibly prolific, productive, popular fiction, there was still respect for writers. We expect them to comment on what's happening in the world. People like J.B. Priestley and H.G. Wells, and even towards the end, I guess, George Orwell on a much lower level in terms of success. The idea that writers are supposed to engage with the political and social developments of the time, but also with a general public, not with an elite public. I mean, I have very little time for the likes of Virginia Woolf in this period, who are writing for a handful of people. I'm interested in the people who are actually getting out there and communicating with millions, and there were a lot of them. There's a respect for literature that I'm not sure still exists. And although Woolf and others are evolving into a highbrow kind of rarefied world, there is still a vast body of middlebrow, and people looking to writers for a lead.
If we take that a little bit beyond literature as well, I think one of the things that stood out to me, and some of the people who most lingered in my mind after finishing the book on a cultural side, what was striking is how they often tended to be from very working class backgrounds. I think that includes Wallace himself, or quite regional in terms of where they were from. So figures like Gracie Fields and somebody I have a great soft spot for, George Formby. I wonder to what extent this feels to you like it was quite an egalitarian period really in culture. And is
Mm.
that in partly because of the changing dynamics of society, which I guess must have to be part of it? But I assume it's also, or is it also, partly a reflection of the fact that you say if you're writing incredibly or performing very highbrow stuff for a very small number of people, there may not be a ceiling on the respect that you can attract from the critics, but there is on the people you can get into the audience. Realistically, there's just a bigger market for mass entertainment.
Yeah, it is a time of the mass, and it's a time of recorded entertainment. I mean, books obviously are fixed, but so now are films. Films much more dominant than the stage is at this point. The music is increasingly being consumed on record. That idea of fixing a version of something is moves it away from the live audience into something much wider and with a much wider circulation. I think it's yeah, there is that strong working class element that is also there in some of the more business side of culture, the likes of Billy Butlin setting up holiday camps, and again coming from a working class background, but seeing an opportunity. Or Mr. Drage, the man who popularises hire purchase at this stage. There is that. It is a reasonably open time for people to come through. Yes.
It's a period of enormous change, I would think, as well, in terms of the lives and the experience of the average British person. I mean, one of the sections I found fascinating, just made me think of it then when talking about Butlin and the creation of Butlins, is how this seems to be a time in which the mobility of people around the country is increasing a huge amount. I mean, I jotted down that the figures that you used, in 1932, there were 34 million long distance coach journeys and 5
Mm.
billion bus journeys. There was, of course, a period of time when people in this country were relatively fixed, because not necessarily in the living memory of this period, because we've had the explosion of the railways, etc. But this does feel like, in part, it's a more literally physically active kind of period of time for the people living in this country in terms of where they're going and what they're experiencing and what they're able to see. And that social life of the average Briton in the interwar years is changing quite rapidly.
Yeah, and you have the rise of motorised transport is key to a lot of this. Not necessarily the private motor car, which is still a very possession, but the motorised coaches and motorbikes, much bigger
Yeah,
then than now. The idea of the motorbike with the sidecar,
yeah,
they were almost as numerous as cars themselves. People were moving a lot, and in a way that if Siegfried Sassoon's memoirs of a fox hunting man, set just before the First World War, he talks about how one's social life is roughly a 10-mile diameter. It's as far as you can go and back in a day on a horse-drawn vehicle. And that's now gone entirely. The road is now is now motorized rather than dominated by horses. It does expand people's range of experience and yeah, of recreation.
on the motorbike, my grandmother was born in 1921, and I can remember her telling me about their family holidays on her father's motorbike and sidecar, where her father and mother would be on the motorbike and she and her sister would be in the sidecar, and they were in Leicester. He worked in hosiery and textiles in Leicester, and they go from Leicester down to Somerset in this motorbike and sidecar. You mentioned, I think in the preface of the book, about how when you wrote this book, you were mindful of your own family members who were living in this era, and some of these people you mentioned by name. So, were you shaped in how you wrote about ordinary life by thinking about any stories that you had heard from older family members who had lived through the interwar years?
It was more influence on the cultural side. My father, who was a band leader in the army, had a great love of British dance bands in the 1930s. This was the stuff he grew up listening to, was Henry Hall on the BBC with the BBC Dance Orchestra. Um, and it was that side of it more that shaped a huge amount of what I put in there. The things that I'd grown up listening to. His collection of 78 RPM, the old 10-inch records of the comedian Sandy Powell, who was the first man to discover that you could make a very good living out of releasing comedy records. They were a large part of my childhood, was listening to those old 78s of Sandy Powell. I feel connected to this culture quite closely. And I had always read the likes of John Buchan and Edgar Wallace and so on. The adventure fiction was a very large part of my childhood, some considerable time after.
On that theme, I wonder if there's anybody in particular from music or literature or elsewhere from this period who's maybe forgotten about today, who you would particularly recommend to people if they're to try and get a feel really for the interwar years and to what the culture was like and what it was like to be in this country at that time. Is there anybody in particular you recommend?
I would always recommend John Buchan. I suspect he'd be largely forgotten had it not been that Alfred Hitchcock made a film of the 39 Steps, which is a perfectly okay book, but it's not in the top 10 John Buchan novels. The rest of it is much better than that. It is good, but even the character Richard Hannay, who's the star of the 39 Steps, there's another 4 books, all of which are better than that. And Buchan is one of the great writers of the time, in addition to being the Governor General of Canada and all his various other interests and activities. I mean, these are people who put one to shame, the sheer workload that they endured. And so not even beyond the likes of Edgar Wallace and John Creasy. Yeah, I don't know. They just seem to have so much more time. Probably because they haven't got social media to distract them.
I'm sure that's right. And actually, I'm delighted you mentioned Buchan. I'm a great fan of his, partly because I think Memory Hold the Door is superb in terms of memoirs and reflections. I like that book a great deal. We also live not too far away from where he's buried, or where his ashes are interned in Oxfordshire.
I would recommend Hunting Tower as his finest work. Goes back to the issue of the communist threat.
It's funny you mention that. There's a bookshop not too far from us in Wantage that has quite a big collection of the Penguin paperbacks, and I always look there to see what there is. And they had the Hunting Tower when I was there last, and having read about it in your book, I picked it up. So somewhere dotted around this room is a copy of that. So I'll bump it up the reading list.
Terrifically good.
I guess we begin to draw the discussion to a bit of a close. I mean, a couple of things that occurred to me when reading the book, and I think it's a tremendous achievement, this book, both in terms of the depth of the cultural exposition, really, what it's like to be in Britain at this time. I found that really fascinating, and how that sits alongside what really is something where if you just were to say to somebody, these are the list of things that a country is going to go through sort of in this period of time. Now you're going to have the aftermath of such a brutal war. Something we've not mentioned, you're going to have a pandemic. There's a Spanish flu and the fallout of that. You're going to have the death of a major party as a viable party of government. You're going to lose a big chunk of the country territorially on the subject of what is going to be, or has been already, one of the great dividing lines of British politics. You're going to have the crash in the Great Depression, the creation, like I say, of millions of new voters, working class men and women, an abdication crisis, for God's sake. I mean, there's literally almost nothing that doesn't happen in this period in terms of drama. And alongside it, what sort of staggers me to some of my fingers, a little bit full circle on where we started, is you begin this period with George V, a tremendously reassuring figure, I think, in many ways, to have as king and emperor. And relatively early into the interwar years, the emergence of Stanley Baldwin, again, as almost the supreme reassuring prime minister. And then towards the end of the period, you have Baldwin ushering in the reign of George VI. And alongside these challenges, which feel like they could have destroyed almost so many constitutional settlements, and of course in parts of the world and parts of the continent did, as you've got the rise of the dictators and more going on. There's this sort of tremendous stability, really, that goes alongside it, which I think makes this a really fascinating and sort of understudied period. I wonder, just to sort of wrap us up, what your great takeaways are from the interwar years, and having particularly comparing it to, say, all the other works you've done about the Edwardians, about the 70s, 80s, 90s, and then into this century as well. What the standout qualities of this period of time, perhaps that you wish that we still had a little bit more of today?
I think stability, strong and stable government, as we were once promised. Not promised at this time, but delivered, which is much more impressive. It does feel to be very safe. As you say, all of these things that should be massively disruptive, nearly 1 million men lost in the war, and certainly over 1 million by the time you factor in the Spanish flu. It should have been an extraordinarily disturbed, disrupted period, and it's not. And I find that utterly fascinating, why Britain remains committed to democracy, committed to the parliamentary process, unwilling to even countenance the concept of extremist politics. I mean, we haven't mentioned him, but normally when people talk about the 30s, Oswald Mosley looms large. He's barely worth a footnote. I mean, I do give him more than that, I admit, but so I may be contributing to the myth of Oswald Mosley, but he's really not important. I mean, he's much more interesting when he's in the Labour Party. Once he forms the British Union of Fascists, he puts himself so far out on the spectrum that nobody is interested anymore. At his absolute peak, he's got 40,000 members at a time when the trade unions have 6 million. And he's the most successful extremist politician we have. The Communist Party are even smaller. I just find that absolutely intriguing, that Europe is consumed by extremism and Britain stays utterly moderate.
Well, A Shellshocked Nation really is a book I can't recommend enough, and I hope in this conversation we've done it a little bit of justice. Maybe one thing we haven't fully done justice to is it's also a very funny book. I mean, one of the things that I think defines a Turner work is perhaps that there's so many little bits that are picked out, which actually, when put side by side or just when explained, become incredibly funny. And I happen to think I'd mention one of my favourite parts, which is about the Empire exhibition and the Canadian pavilion. She say had the best exhibit of all, a life-size effigy of the Prince of Wales and his horse, carved in butter. The intention was that when the exhibition ended, the model would be broken down and sold off in pots, each weighing around £1. Regrettably, it turned out that sculpting butter contained preservatives that made it inedible, and instead it was sold off to a railway company as wagon grease. And I think that's a great example of what is also there throughout this book as well. Just the moments of light and comedy and humour, intended but very often unintended, that also define a national life. So to listeners, we very strongly recommend A Shell-Shocked Nation, Britain Between the Wars.